Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this edition of the Zero to Hero partner webinar series. Usually I bring in subject matter experts beyond sales, but today I have a very special guest, Chris DuCousso. I've been excited about this one for several months now. He and I'll get into the specifics in a bit more detail later, but he and I worked together on some really exciting enterprise deals back when I was at Dropbox and Slack and when he was at News Corp. But beyond that, he has a storied career, which I'll get into. But today, the topic is really chatting about how negotiation philosophies have changed. Chris has seen a lot since he's been in the workforce. I've seen a sliver of that, but I thought, no better than to bring in one of the experts in procurement and business and Chris to battle test some of the things that I coach founders and salespeople on. So Chris, thanks so much for spending time with me today.
Well, and thank you, Peter, for having me and for that rather charming introduction. Yeah, so my background, so I started in technology way back when, quite a long time ago, longer ago than I care to remember, to be fair, as a project manager. So I came from a tech background, solving problems for organizations, and I went into consulting. I spent some time at IBM Global Services, providing consultancy services, again, technology, principally in the investment banking sector. And I also worked at Glaxo Wellcome, and that's partly where I started getting more involved on the buy side, resolving client-vendor disputes. And I worked extensively with the BBC as well in the same sort of capacity. And then that led to me joining News Corp. So the group CTO of News Corp worked with me at the BBC, and I got asked to go there and solve some of their problems in that organisation, and I ended up being the Global Head of Procurement for that organisation at that time. And since then, I've been running some businesses with my wife. We have some various property businesses and also a sports-related business, and I've been doing some consultancy as well. So this is, for me, an opportunity to get back into the mix, start talking about working with people, engagement, building partnerships, which is a subject which I love, and helping sales folks better deliver the outcomes that they're looking for, and also help some procurement folks understand how better to engage with sales folks, and moving away from the more typified adversarial type relationship into the more, how can we create a sort of win-win scenario from our engagement. So that's what this podcast is about, and that's certainly an area that interests me, and hopefully those that have tuned in.
I really appreciate that, Chris. And yeah, speaking of our background, when we first met, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a combination of your experience and the British accent where I was like, oh, wow, this is an intimidating situation, especially because, 10 plus years ago, I was just starting to dabble into enterprise sales myself. But you were such a big part of helping guide me through the News Corp organization. And then again at Slack. So thanks again. And I want to echo for the audience that, typically I do hear also from sales folks, hey, like I hate dealing with procurement, but that wasn't my experience with you, which is why we're talking today. And a lot of what we're going to touch on is tactically through our experience, how that played out through some of our deals. And hopefully, towards the end of this podcast, we'll be able to also answer some live questions from the audience because, the tangible things you're dealing with are going to be most helpful to answer, I'm sure. So thank you again, Chris.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into it. Before we get into the actual meat of the content, here's a roadmap for what we're going to discuss. First, I'm going to have Chris talk about his viewpoints and perspectives on how deal making has changed since he's been in the game. And then we're going to go into, as you all know, the folks who know me, I love thinking about mentalities and phraseology. And so I'm going to talk about a few examples around how I think negotiation should be thought of and played out. And we'll get pretty tactical there. We're not going to cover all the nuts and bolts of negotiation, but we'll try and at least touch on how our philosophies play out in the real world. And then we'll open it up to Q&A. And then one other thing that Chris has invested his time into is we actually have a 2-pager white paper that we're happy to send to the audience afterwards around more nitty-gritty details that Chris thinks about when brokering these enterprise deals. So hopefully that'll be a good leave behind guide. So let's dive into it, Chris. Why don't we just talk about this slide and kind of how you've seen in broad strokes things change in sales and procurement.
Yeah, so I think originally when as technology evolved, it started with people, as it does with most purchasing exercises, people buying a product rather than necessarily services. Obviously, there was consultancy, but principally when people bought something, they bought it as a capital item. Even some cases, professional services can be capitalized. And it's a one-time transaction. You buy that, you run it in-house, and you operate that. And it's a fixed cost, and you understand that. So from a finance perspective, all of that's clearly defined. The budget's been approved. It's depreciated over time. And it's a one-time transaction. And whatever deal that you manage to achieve in that purchasing exercise is the deal. And you would call that, in sort of negotiating terms, it's a spot transaction. There's very little relational aspect to it. I've bought something, I have that asset. I may never see those people again. I may want to buy from them again. But it is more of a win-lose type engagement in terms of pricing. The transition has been now, over the last sort of decade or so, more to services with the advent of cloud and subscription-based services, where the purchaser, the customer, doesn't own the assets that they're buying. They're buying them as services, so they don't have the same free rein to manage, administer, or operate those services in the same way that they had in previous decades. And the change there means that they are organizations far more reliant on the depth of the relationship they have with their providers than they previously were. So go back to the pre-2010 date, as per the slide. Most organizations, if they were procuring technology, had their technology department effectively as the integrator, running and operating those services, and generally choosing what products they wanted to buy in order to maximize or provide specific functions layered on top of the infrastructure they may have bought.
Sure.
Fast forward to today, that's no longer the case. There's a big ecosystem within the major cloud providers that provide ease of interoperability, and don't require the customer to be the integrator. And that's presented a number of challenges for organizations. They feel somewhat hemmed in. You often see it being called vendor lock-in. And that's really cloud providers being the victim of their own success. They've created great products. Those products integrate seamlessly within their own APIs, as you would expect them to. And the customer can no longer go and pick and choose and say, actually, I'm not going to use those products anymore. I'm going to start using something else. The transition's difficult. The integration becomes difficult. And financially, it's somewhat challenging as well. And the model's changed, of course, with sort of elastic compute, cloud-based services. Now, the consumer experience may well be better, but that's not visible to finance. What finance tend to see is the cost increase with the elastic compute, elastic demand. And they don't necessarily see what the revenue upside is of that. Whereas in the past, they built a data center, they capitalized it, and they ran that, and the cost didn't change. Maybe a customer couldn't log in, maybe it didn't work, maybe there was a flood of demand. I don't know if you're a news organization, you may have had maybe an election event or a sports event, or if you're a banking organization, maybe there's month-end filings, year-end filings, whatever, so there's driving traffic. In the old days, people may see a slow service. Today, technology departments can scale up instantly, spin up instances on their platforms, driving cost but improving the user experience. So that creates some dissent within organizations in terms of how that cost is factored, how that cost is tracked back into the organization in terms of a value perspective. And then on top of that, if you decide you do want to transition wholesale, lock, stock and barrel, you haven't got the luxury of depreciated assets that you can sweat. You've got to continue paying for the service that you currently have while you transition to another one. And at the same time, you may not know how long that transition is going to take. You've got to write a contract for a term because these are term-based services. So it gets quite complicated. And you see lots of organizations regarding that as, and calling that, it's sort of pejorative term, vendor lock-in. I'm locked in with my vendor. When actually really they like it too much. That's one way of looking at it. They like the product so much and feel that it's hard to switch away, and maybe they don't want to switch away, but equally they don't feel they can. And there was a recent article, actually last year, published by the Office of Governance Commerce in the UK. UK government let slip, for whatever reason, that they felt they were paying too much, and we'll come on to this in the later part of the presentation, too much for, in their case, I think they cited AWS specifically, services. So we'll talk a little bit about the fact that cost isn't the only driver, but vendor lock-in drives that perception. It's a fixed pie mentality. They're not looking at the value of the services, they're looking at the cost of the services. And the fact that those services become ubiquitous in the organization, and it's difficult to switch out and use other products because the ones that are readily available from the existing vendor base are so effective, it breeds a degree of mistrust and a feeling of vendor lock-in. So we'll talk about that as we go through the program.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate you covering this, because initially, like I was saying, there could be this perception that vendor lock-in is low because all these technologies pride themselves on being like a low friction implementation project, right? But I think this is important for our listeners to understand. It's actually not the case that vendor lock-in is low just because your product is easy to implement, because there's so much in the ecosystem that folks are investing in that even if it is a cloud platform that theoretically you can plug out, you've invested so much in the ecosystem already, right? So this is why building trust, and this is why people spend so much time, 6, 9, 12 months making a decision even on a startup, because to them, it's not just turning on the technology, it's a change management exercise that goes across their entire tech stack and loads of business units, right? So
that's right. And you'll see, again, I think the loss of power from organizations and their technology departments being the integrator plays a psychological role in how organizations feel about a third-party vendor. You've got less control. If you run an IT department and you want to change something, for whatever reason, maybe good or bad, you can direct your staff to do that. It's your cost. You can run and you can operate that. If you want to change something with a third party, you have to have a deep relationship with them in order to affect that change. They're not obligated to do it. It may not be a change they particularly want to do. It may not be something that's core or germane to their overall broader business, even if it might be important to you. So that's where cultivating and fostering those relationships has become more important today than it was perhaps a few years ago. Because now, instead of going to a team that you manage and asking them to make changes or implement functionality, you have to go to a third party. Now, some of that might be configuration that you can do in-house, but some of it actually might be roadmap-based, require feature development, changes to the actual platform or its design in order to affect the changes that you want. And that's, again, it comes down to what that relationship is with that third party. And I think a large part of the problem within customer organizations is they haven't made that mental paradigm shift from a spot-based transaction to a relational one. Most of us in our daily lives are used to buying something from a shop. Buying a car or buying a house or any big ticket item is fundamentally a spot transaction. It's transient. Once I bought a house, I don't really care how upset the vendor was at the time. The deal is done. I've come out ahead, hopefully, and I'm happy. Same with a car. But what folks often fail to realize is how you approach a deal, particularly in technology sales, drives a lot about how drives to a large extent the results that you can expect to achieve. Most folks you'll see, particularly in procurement departments, will talk significantly or extensively about how tough they are to negotiate. But actually, what's needed in the modern paradigm is an ability to be fair, pragmatic, build relationships, be tough, but be fair and reasonable in your approach to your vendor, because a large part of what you want to get from that organization's going to depend on the advocacy the person that you're interfacing with is prepared to put into behind the scenes. And that's something that's often missed. A lot of people think that they can bully suppliers into achieving outcomes. And that's sometimes true. If it's a very small supplier and you're a big customer, that could be true. But generally speaking, if we look at our lives, and I like to always look at these things through a human life perspective, if you like, we generally accept that we get more from people. Actually, let's put it this way. Imagine you're running a team of people. Do you get better results from that team by trying to bully them into giving them what you want? Or do you get better results by encouraging them and explaining to them why you want the results that you do? And I think one of the problems we face with the vendor-client relationship is people on the buy side see the vendor as outside the domain of their organization and therefore don't need to extend necessarily the same approach to engagement. But actually you're still dealing with people. They may be the other side of a boundary in your organization, but ultimately they're still people. You'll get the most from salespeople when they understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, what your constraints are, and what fixes you need to address that. And sometimes a vendor will come back with a solution to a problem that you had that's different to the one that you articulated, but actually overall solves the problem, which is why we come back to, it isn't just about price, it's about value. So, and when we talk about that, we're talking predominantly about the overall package of services. That's really what we're talking about. And the more scope you give a vendor to come back to you with a portfolio of solutions, the more likely you are to get to an overall result. And what we often see, particularly with procurement departments, but you see it with the tech folks as well when they're negotiating directly in the absence of a procurement department, is people specifically saying, well, I don't want to pay for this, but I accept that, or I need this like this, without explaining why. And a simple example might be, actually, what is it that you all need? What's the price you need to get to and why? And actually, this is what we can do. We can package that up. And we can't give that for free, but what we can do is we can give you a TCO model or a TCO contract pricing, which actually meets all of your ROI objectives going forward. It doesn't necessarily meet it at a line item level, but as a package ticks all of your boxes because that's what we can get approved internally. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that, particularly on the customer side, and fail to think about, okay, if I'm going to be open with the vendor, this is where I need to get to. I mean, when I've worked across multiple organizations solving vendor problems or vendor disputes, the biggest problem has always tended to be when I've come into to an issue that's been escalated to a dispute is the customer is dictating, I have a problem and this is what I want solved. But actually, that isn't really the problem they want solved. It's just the way they think they can solve it with that vendor. Often, if you tell the vendor, actually, this is provided you can tell them, this is the problem I've got. This is what it's causing to my business. This is how I think it relates to what you're doing. How can you help me fix that problem? Very often, a salesperson can go away, talk internally, escalate it up the chain within an organization, and they can come back with, we can't do that, but now we understand what your challenge is, we can do this for you, right? And that makes a big difference. Actually, that solved my problem. It's not the way I thought I was going to solve it, but it does solve my problem. And buyers, particularly now with the cloud-based services, want to understand and feel that they've got a trusted partner. Now, that's not true at every level in an organization, but what sales folks need to recognize is, and I think there's a slide on it later on about engaging multiple stakeholders, there will always be someone within an organization that understands the bigger picture. And it's important, I think, for sales folks to find out who that person or people are and get them engaged in that process.
Yeah. Relationships take time. And yeah, like you mentioned trust several times. I think that's the biggest thing, right? Between vendors and buyers. And the pre-contract period is almost like a dress rehearsal for the next 3 to 5 years. And so why don't we actually get into some of the tactical components of like what is negotiation and what isn't from an approach standpoint, right? And Chris, I think you touched on a lot of it. So we could probably get through some of this pretty quickly. But a lot of salespeople think, there's still this question in sales training where people are trained to ask, hey, are you the decision maker? Right? And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's actually the wrong question, because